Good morning. For my AP students, you're enjoying what was a 2-hour delay that turned into a snow day, and all I hear doing outside is raining. That's giving me a chance to work on another flipped classroom, a lecture on Chapter 23. Well, we just finished Period 4 in AP, off to Period 5, Industrialization and Global Integration from 1750 to 1900. Period 5 is catching up to the time period that a lot of you are more familiar with from your classes that you've taken at Missing over the last few years. And that familiarity will really help. Today we're going to start by looking at Chapter 23, The Making of the New Europe. As you know, we're going to go around the world looking at different regions during Period 5. So we're going to start with Europe, largely because of Europe's domination during this time. Peter Stearns starts on page 526 talking about something that I got to admit was a bit striking to me. This is a Thomas Nast political cartoon of the same topic. The United States in the 1800s was having to deal with the fact that the world was becoming industrial, the world was becoming global, and these were seen in cities like Milwaukee and Chicago. Here you see St. Crispin working diligently, making shoes like he did in France. And behind him are the threats of the Chinese, the cheap labor. See, in the later part of the 1800s, the United States was having a particularly hard time with the influx of cheap Asian labor. Chinese were coming here looking for jobs and opportunities, being driven away from their homeland because of lack of opportunity and overpopulation. Once they got here, things went well, and then things went poorly, eventually culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yes, we had a law against just the Chinese entering. I think that really says a lot about the world, and specifically the United States, in the mid-1800s. Speaking of the mid-1800s, this is what Europe kind of looked like. You could see the German Empire and Italy and Russia and France and England. The reason why I'm speaking like this is so many of you had me in ninth grade when we studied World War I. And kind of what you see here are the countries set up for World War I. Now, this is a map of Europe towards the end of the 1800s. And that is the topic at the end of period 5, the end of chapter 23. So what I want to do today is kind of get to this map. How did we get these countries in the political and economic situations they were in? So to be honest, the consolidation of the industrial order 1850-1914 is the end of Peter Stearns' chapter 23, with new nations rising up, with governments that are becoming to realize they need to reform themselves to avoid revolution. We still do that today. Key issues like voting rights and freedom of religion, key issues that are still alive in the United States today. They were promoting an active foreign policy that creates nationalism within. This still happens in the United States and Europe today. Expanding empires where people are balancing out with what they care about abroad with what they do actually care about at home. New nations are being formed. Now these are the nations that will kind of come to dominate the early 1900s. Italy, Germany, and the United States. Italy, Germany, and the United States were not on the national scene until the end of the 1800s. They become industrial powers, they become regional powers, trade powers, and eventually look abroad to expand. So that's kind of where I want to get to today in my chapter 23 lectures. How did these come into being? Relatively liberal welfare states, industrial states, looking to not just solidify power within, but to solidify power abroad. Well, let's go back. What are some of the major themes of chapter 23? Well, one would be political upheaval for much of the time. Exportation of Western European institutions to regions around the world, which is mostly chapter 24. Some of the major changes. Monarchies that dominated the latter part of the 1700s are going to be replaced by parliaments with extensive suffrage. North America emerges a major force in world economics, supplying the cash crops such as cotton to not just the United States but abroad. Now, there are going to be a series of disruptions, revolutions and wars that are going to be both internal and regional. New states emerge. New alliances emerge. Those new alliances are going to eventually lead to World War I, as we studied in ninth grade. Now, there are going to be phases of Western transformation. I'm going to show them on the next slide. We have 1750 to 1775, the era right in front of the United States' war for independence. It's a growing crisis. Regional powers conflicting with each other. They're fighting in Europe, but they're also fighting in their the countries or territories they hold abroad, like the French and Indian War. From 1775 to 1850, political revolution that is simultaneously going along with the Industrial Revolution. You really can't extrapolate them. You have to blend them together. For every new technology causes an impact, and every impact causes the political repercussions. And then from 1850 to 1914, we have the implications of this last 100 years of an industrial revolution. And some would say that implication ends and culminates with World War I. Now, the age of revolution. Well, we have a lot of forces of change going on. We have cultural change that really stems from the intellectual movement we call the Enlightenment. This movement is not just about how we live, but the relationship we have with the leaders, our governments. And what we're going to start to see is a gap between the leaders who are in charge, the aristocrats, the monarchies, and the thinkers, the younger, the new. I have a list. If you've ever taken Euro, these are the names that you absolutely know. And it's really hard for me to go into detail in each one. From Rousseau saying there should be a social contract where people will abide as long as the government supplies. We still have a social contract today. The government needs to create an environment of protection, safety, and if they do, the people are obligated to respect that. From Montesquieu and Locke and Voltaire and Adam Smith and Beccaria, and I'll go back, just those five. Those five, in my opinion, are the basis of the United States' Constitution. From saying we shouldn't just have one part of government and an executive. We need to have different parts that have different checks and balances. It's John Locke that gave birth to the concept of life, liberty, and property. Beccaria, Smith, Voltaire. Adam Smith, I always liked that one because Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was released, that book, in 1776. So yes, the war for independence began, but in my opinion, Adam Smith and capitalism has possibly even a greater impact on the world still today. I did a paper on Immanuel Kant, this concept that the more democracy there is in a country, the more likely that country will stay at peace. People don't vote for war. And of course, if you start looking at World War II and you see the dictators, you see how those dictators negate democracy, thus have war. Hobbes and Malthus, they're Enlightenment thinkers. They just, in some ways, are contradictory to the people above. The idea that we're going to run out of food and need to deal with it. The idea that we do need to have an enlightened despot. We need to have this paternalistic leader who's going to take care of us even though he has an unduly amount of power. And now I think the children of the above are the Thomas Paine and the Thomas Jefferson, the Marquis de Lafayette. Maybe you recognize some of their names. So my Euro kids are like, oh my God, he's going to go in more detail. And of course, I'm not. That's where I end. A little bit more about the Age of Revolution. Well, new business people are challenging the old aristocrats, the aristocracy, where new global trade and regional trade, capitalistic ideas are going to contend against this power structure. The old people, the landed wealth, are going to have contradictions with those who are self-made men. A population revolution. We are going to have population, hey, thank you, soap, going up in France, Great Britain, Prussia. The effects are going to be great. The upper class are going to feel threatened. They're going to try and build a bureaucracy that excludes others. While this working class gets larger and larger and larger, as the aristocrats who only have landed wealth protect that landed wealth, the only way to make your own affluence in life is to be part of more of an urban life, a more of a skilled or unskilled labor force, a working class. And what we're going to see is a rapid expansion of domestic manufacturing from the proto-industrialization, where people would go into their own homes and in an organized fashion put out shoes, a plethora of shoes to be sold not just by themselves, but by a larger entity. And what we're going to see is these cottage industries are going to be the backbone of what will eventually be the mass production of the 1900s. We're going to even have new altered behaviors you could read more about in Stearns. But basically, when one's affluence can be obtained by one's self, that also changes your political and social behaviors. Your wants, your desires trump the dictates of societal and political norms. Meaning, obviously, capitalism leads to individualism. Both thrive in democracy and will lead to revolution if not listened to. At this point, I'd like you to go ahead and watch some crash course on the American and French revolutions on your own. I'm not going to cover them in this lecture. I have a quiz for you on the crash course episode. A lot of it is from review. Don't forget that in 9th grade we watched the History Channel's French Revolution, and I've given you a photocopy of a video guide of it. All right? And continuing. All right. Now the French Revolution is over. It's 1815, and we see at the Congress at Vienna more of a modern world map is being brewed. Modern European map is being brewed. And when you have this new map emerging, we have a new sense of nationalism. That nationalism, some 100 years later, is going to conflict in World War I and II in what I would likely call uber nationalism. So how did we get there? Well, what we're going to start to see at the Congress of Vienna is people at the top of the leadership systems of these countries are going to try and create power structures, bureaucracy, borders, and we start to see more of a modern map emerging, but this modern map is going to be led by conservatives who yearn for the old days of monarchy. Not just because monarchy is fun if you're at the top and you can be rich and powerful, but because monarchy promotes stability. Well, come on, it used to promote stability for hundreds, thousands of years. Monarchies promoted stability. So wouldn't it be nice to go back to that? The French Revolution tried to say the rising up of the people can change, but when everybody lost their head, it didn't really work out. So let's see. Now we're going to have two major systems going against each other. We have the conservatives and the liberals. And yes, by today's standards, that is our political parties in the United States. But really, it emerges out of a sense of who's in charge, who shall lead, what type of reform should we have, what type of freedom should we have. These are conversations you didn't have in 1600, and they're the type of conversations that after the Congress of Vienna, it's hard to squash. And now you're going to see 20 to 30 years where these nations are going to try to keep a conservative grasp, and that grasp is going to be hard for them. You see the rising up the radicals. This is the era where socialism is going to be more formulated. This is the Marxist era. That it just predates him, but it's the basis of Marx and Engels' work. You see radicals are gaining steam in all the major powers, especially the emerging power with Greece breaking away from the Ottomans, Italy and Germany forming. The United States takes away land obligations for voting in what we consider Jacksonian democracy. You see Britain in the Reform Bill of 1832 grants the parliamentary vote to middle-class men. One of my favorite one is the Luddites who can't stand this emerging machine-led world and literally will go into these early factories of the early 1820s and 30s and destroy the factories because it's those factories that are taking away the livelihood of middle-class men. You see the factory workers of the skilled and unskilled are trying to organize. The Chartist movement was those speaking on behalf of the middle class men, the men that wanted to formulate the rights of those who work, especially those who were skilled. To my opinion, the Chartist movement is the beginning of the unions that still exist today. The revolutions of 1848 is the climax of this protest, with revolutions breaking out all over Europe. France starts up with its conflict between the people's rights and the people's power and that of the government. And what we're going to start to see is revolution struggles. However, it leads its final impact. Yes, there might be some authoritarian forces, but those authoritarian forces need to abide or respect the people to a degree, or you're going to have another revolution. Like, I would like to say that Bismarck has a welfare state, not because he loves the people, wants to care for the people, but if you keep the people at bay, keep them quiet, keep them slightly cared for, you won't at least have another revolution. I mean, if you really think of 2016, and you start thinking of some of the movements we see in modern world, modern America, the government needs to listen to those, or we truly will have blood in the streets. Wow, that was a lot. Now, chapter 23 talks a lot about the rise of these countries that I mentioned here and why and how these countries come into being. But then Peter Stearns starts going into chapter 23 where he talks about Louis Pasteur and Sigmund Freud. I definitely think you want to give that a good old overview. All right? Have a good one.